Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you. I am Tamiko Brown-Nagin, and I am the director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute and the co-director of the Harvard Law and History program, both of which are co-sponsoring this program. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I do want to thank Jonathan Booth, who is the Law and History Fellow, for helping to make this event possible, as well as my assistant, Damie Sung, who is here somewhere, and Kelly Garvin from the Houston Institute. Thank you for all your work. So we have a treat for you today, a talk by a distinguished professor of 20th century history and social movements who is going to talk about an incredibly salient issue. Nancy MacLean is the William H. Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, and she is the author of many books, including Behind the Mask of Chivalry, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan, and Freedom Is Not Enough, The Opening of the American Workplace. MacLean's scholarship has received more than a dozen prizes and awards. Her most recent book, which she'll talk about today, is called Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, which has generated a robust conversation among scholars and in the media. Book list called Democracy in Chains, perhaps the best explanation to date of the roots of the political divide that threatens to break our government. The Guardian said, "It's the missing chapter, a key to understanding the politics of the past half-century." Democracy in Chains has been longlisted for the National Book Award. And with that, I present to you Nancy MacLean. Welcome, Nancy.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I am honored to be speaking under the auspices of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. The Brown decision played a formative role in history, my book reveals, albeit in a manner that even a legal genius like Houston could never have envisioned. But let me start with the obvious. American politics are in crisis, in Washington and in the majority of states. Even elementary norms of civic decency and truth are in crisis. You know this. It has become inescapable of late. Sorry about that. Did you hear me? Great. Okay, now you hear me better. This has become inescapable. But what you might still be struggling to figure out is how we got here and what it means. The watershed that we have reached in our public life has been fed by many streams, of course, some of which have received extensive attention from scholars. Those streams include the movement conservatism that made Barry Goldwater the Republican candidate for president in 1964 after his arguments against Brown versus Board of Education and his vote against the Civil Rights Act of that year. And of course, those streams also include the religious right. These were pivotal developments, and they've yielded the votes needed to effect radical right policy changes that we're now seeing multiplying. But I'm here today to talk about another piece of the puzzle of how we reach the situation in which we find ourselves, one that is much less well known. And that is the ideas that are guiding the billionaire-funded libertarian right made notorious by Charles Koch. I believe it is a crucial missing piece because it explains so much that otherwise remains mysterious. And is a piece that needs more attention because there's an unmarked hazard in our situation right now. The noisiest threats are getting the most notice. Among them, the now chronic race baiting, insults, and bullying coming from the White House. But as the spectacle created by its current occupant fixates the nation, a more enduring effort is moving along apace. In the 30 states now wholly dominated by a radicalized Republican Party, including my own North Carolina, in federal agencies, and in the courts. That project is being pursued by a much smaller and quieter group, and its architects aim to alter the ground rules of our society permanently. I'll state my case simply. Behind all this seeming chaos and dysfunction in our public life, there is a strategy in play, a cold-eyed, step-by-step strategy. And that strategy is far along. One of its field generals said this to donors in late 2015, and I quote, "We're close to winning. They," meaning the critics or the rest of us, "don't have the real plan. Don't have the real plan." That was Mark Holden, the head of Koch Industries' government and public affairs operation, gloating to an invitation-only audience of wealthy donors who are far to the right of even most Republican voters. Now, you've heard a great deal in the last several years about the fortune that Charles Koch and his donor network have been investing in our politics. But what you have likely not heard about is the school of thought that has lately made those investments so devastatingly effective. The technology, as Koch, who earned 3 engineering degrees from MIT, refers to it. It was an academic economist I learned in the course of my research who taught Charles Koch that for capitalism of the kind he believes in to thrive, democracy must be enchained. And that economist outlined steps to achieve this. The book that I'm here to talk to you about, Democracy in Chains, provides the unknown backstory to this defining moment in which we find ourselves, as it traces that real path to which Mark Holden referred. In essence, it is the story of 2 men, a thinker and a CEO, whose lives converged through a shared commitment to undercut the model of government that citizen action built up over the course of the 20th century. The thinker was a Tennessee-born economist, James McGill Buchanan, who spent most of his life in Virginia institutions. The CEO, of course, is the Kansas-based Charles Koch, who spent decades, by his own self-narration, spent decades investing in libertarian intellectuals in search of the technology that would enable him to make our country conform to his arch vision of economic liberty, a kind of free-rein capitalism akin to the 19th century variant skewered by Charles Dickens. The history my book conveys is, first of all, of the particular crucible in which Buchanan came up with this idea of enchaining democracy to insulate economic liberty. As the civil rights movement began altering power in Virginia and beyond in the late 1950s and 1960s. And then it is about how Charles Koch began funding a vast apparatus to make that idea a reality in a messianic quest that has produced the volatile situation we are now confronting. In the remainder of my time, though, I want to share with you how I stumbled upon the trail that led me to these conclusions, because knowing the route that took me to what I have just said will, I think, give you a sharper sense of the stakes. After all, I did not set out to write about this story, to uncover this history. I had never heard of either James Buchanan or Charles Koch when I embarked on the research that became this book. They found me, you could say. Let me explain. As Tomiko said, I am a historian of American social movements and their impact on public policy, with a long-standing interest in the US South and in the political right. And in 2006, at the archives of the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia, I came across the tragic tale of Prince Edward County, Virginia, whose white officials answered local black high school students' 1951 strike for a decent school and the Supreme Court's call to desegregate without further delay in answer partly to that case, which was one of the 5 folded into Brown. The local officials answered the call to desegregate without further delay by, as the officials put it, quote, going out of the public school business entirely, end quote. The county officials shuttered the entire public school system. They even posted no trespassing signs on the schools. And they left black children with no formal education whatsoever for 5 years as their white peers headed off to private segregation academies with state-subsidized tuition grants, what we would today call vouchers. And the white officials persisted in this course for 5 years until the courts compelled them to reinstate a public school system. Shocked and deeply moved by this story, and rather embarrassed that I had never heard of it, even though it was well known to people of a certain generation, I began researching. And I found that tax-funded school vouchers were crucial to the story. I also learned that the University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman had issued his first call for vouchers in 1955 in the full knowledge of how it would be used by Southern states. So Friedman became part of my story, and this became an early moment that we don't know about in the history of American neoliberalism. But in following a footnote, I learned of a 1959 report as this Prince Edward County threat was in the air by two other economists, both Chicago alumni, who had set up a new center of political economy at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in 1956, and one of them was James Buchanan. Their report attempted to refute the moderate whites who were then trying to save Virginia's public schools by saying that the state could not afford two schools. It already had a beggared public school system. If they drained off resources for private schools, it would destroy education in the state. Some of their own colleagues at the University of Virginia were making this case and had done so in a petition. The Chicago-trained economists rebutted that if the state sold off its school property to private operators, it might provide better education, competitive education, without obeying the courts. Their report, in effect, called for privatizing Virginia's schools before that verb existed. And they did so in the awareness that the schools thus funded would be white segregation academies, because those were the only private schools at issue. Needless to say, it stunned me to see two university professors making a case for what their state's most arch segregationists were seeking. And it intrigued me that they did so not in racial terms, but in economic terms, leveraging the authority of their discipline to support a radical proposal coming from the most extreme anti-democratic figures of the day. Buchanan and his colleague knew that they were exploiting racial animus to move their libertarian economic agenda, one they referred to as the free society, even as they showed no sympathy for the civil rights movement whose slogan was freedom now, and said nothing about the 5 laws against the NAACP that effectively removed its First Amendment rights that were part of this massive resistance package. Their cover letter to one of the legislators, the one who sponsored the anti-NAACP laws, said they were issuing this report in the language of their discipline, quote, letting the chips fall where they may. Letting the chips fall where they may. And that phrase lodged itself in me and kept me wondering about these men who fully understood the harm their actions would inflict, in particular, but not only on black students, and yet they proceeded anyway. And as an educator, I wondered how anyone could do such a thing, not in irrational rage, as some in Southside Virginia were doing, but in cold-eyed calculation. Trying to solve that puzzle, I began seeking more information about Buchanan and learned that he had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986. He won for having pioneered a new approach to political economy called public choice economics, which also became influential in political science and law. What Buchanan did that was new was what he called the economic analysis of politics, but in a manner quite different from, say, Karl Marx's focus on class. Buchanan applied Chicago-style economic models to political actors to argue that they could only be understood as separate individuals seeking their own personal self-interest, not the common good, as they claimed. That led him to a new understanding of deficits that proved persuasive to many. And we can perhaps take that up in the discussion, but I have found that most listening audiences aren't as interested in deficits as in the rest of this history, but happy to cover it in discussion. Anyway, since Buchanan's own training was in public finance, and he was deeply concerned about the growth of the federal government and its powers of taxation and regulation since the Progressive Era and the New Deal, not only the Civil Rights Movement, he and his colleagues turned fresh scrutiny toward the incentives of the political process and how altering the incentives and rules of the process might yield different outcomes. And those ideas have since interested people not on the right, I hasten to add, among them your own Professor Cass Sunstein. And I was disappointed to come into the building today and see that he's actually giving a talk on the book that I am mentioning here, because in his book, Nudge, he and a colleague actually explore how modestly tweaking incentives in public life could, say, improve public health. So these ideas have a wider purchase and have proven very interesting and useful to many. But Buchanan's version of these ideas, his variant, the Virginia School of Political Economy, was always distinctive. Buchanan himself said, looking back in a documentary, that when he set to work, the idea of the public interest was dominant, and people trusted elected officials and others who said that they aimed to serve it. And he reported, and I quote, "That's what I wanted to tear down. That's what I wanted to tear down." Again, I wondered, why would anyone want to do that? I mean, we all know that the public interest is sort of a socially constructed fiction, but it is the essence of deliberative democratic politics since the beginning of deliberative politics. And if you persuade a majority, then we can safely assume your proposal is in the public interest. But reading further, I learned that to a libertarian like Buchanan, there is no common good. Any such notion of shared purpose will lead government to coerce those who don't agree with the majority. And in the case of taxpayers who don't share the majority's view of the public interest, Buchanan argued, it all but steals their property if it taxes them for purposes they don't share. Even in scholarly writing, Buchanan did not shy from conveying his case in an agitational manner sometimes. In his masterwork of 1975, he asked what difference was there between a mugger in Central Park and a government that would take one's property in taxes without consent. We are not our brother's keepers, he was at pains to argue, or at least we should not use government to shift tax revenues from one citizen to another. And he came to frame his analysis in foreboding terms, in fact, in dehumanizing language. He spoke of net tax recipients, those who get more from government than they pay in, those whom Mitt Romney would later famously dub the 47%, not in an accidental piece of speech, but actually he was using figures from the Heritage Foundation's annual Index of Dependency, which charts such things with co-funding. Anyway, Buchanan spoke of net tax recipients as, and I quote, parasites on the productive. He warned of, again his words, predators and prey, employing a vocabulary that made fellow citizens appear as menaces from the animal world. This kind of language, I know from my first book on the Ku Klux Klan, is disinhibiting, whether by intent or by design. It licenses hostility. And it is rife on the American right today, owing to decades of inculcation. But Buchanan did not stop there. Believing this way, as the 1970s opened, he moved from scholarship to organizing in a quest to build what he called, actually before others, a counterintelligentsia, by urging right-wing funders to create, again in his words, a gravy train to recruit and build commitment among a libertarian academic hardcore. And he also shifted from analysis to prescription in what he called constitutional economics. He hoped to devise a legal regime that could protect capitalism from government, that could enshrine the rights of the wealthy minority to a degree no society anywhere had ever done. And he said more than once that on this measure, all existing constitutions in the world were failures. He found a very receptive audience for his vision in Chile. In 1980, Buchanan was invited by the military junta of General Augusto Pinochet and its civilian partners to share his idea for how to draft a constitution to protect capitalism from government. The outcome is still in effect today. In 2013, Michelle Bachelet, a president elected by 2/3 of the Chilean people, on a robust reform platform demanded by huge demonstrations of college students backed by the wider populace, found that when she set to work to deliver the changes they wanted, that the Constitution, in her words, put locks and bolts on what the government could do. not checks and balances to limit possible abuses by the majority of minority rights, but locks and bolts to bind the majority will. Since our audience today contains so many legal scholars, I thought the most apt selection to read from the book would be the story of Buchanan's visit to Santiago and his advice on this Constitution of Liberty, as the regime named the document. So I'll just pause here and share a little from the book. With the 7 modernizations in place, and this was a series of deep structural reforms whose common threads were privatization, deregulation, and state-induced fragmentation of group power, with those 7 modernizations in place, Pinochet's appointees could now focus on drafting a new constitution to entrench this order behind what they hoped would be impassable moats. In preparation, a corporation close to the regime translated James Buchanan's recent work, the one he called his masterwork, The Limits of Liberty, into Spanish. So too, the founders of a pro-regime think tank, the Centro de Estudios Públicos, translated several works of public choice, including a basic primer by Buchanan. Buchanan then visited, in May 1980, a pivotal moment to provide in-person guidance. A few months earlier, the regime had begun a mass purge of professors from the nation's public universities, firing those considered politically unreliable, the New York Times reported. And as a result of such publicity and the assassination of Ambassador Letelier and an American associate in rush hour traffic on Washington, D.C.'s Embassy Row, Chile faced U.S. sanctions for having carried out a terrorist act on American soil. This meant that the Economist's visit had to come on the invitation of private actors, in Buchanan's case, from the Adolfo Ibáñez's Foundation's Business School. Its dean, Carlos Francisco Cáceres, and Buchanan had had a long conversation at the 1979 Madrid meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. Cáceres, one of the most anti-democratic members of the Council of State, which is saying a lot, it was a body created to advise Pinochet, Cáceres was eager to bring Buchanan's opinions into the regime's discussions of a new constitution. It worked. The Virginian's true host, in fact, was the Chilean Minister of Finance, Sergio de Castro, the regime's leading thinker and an economist indebted to Pinochet for enabling him and his colleagues to, as he put it, expunge a half-century of errors when public opinion was very much against us, end quote. Which is why de Castro and others saw a pressing need for a new constitution, which would make public dissatisfaction irrelevant, or at least sharply curtail the people's ability to reverse the transformation he and his junta colleagues had imposed by force. Cáceres told Buchanan directly that, quote, "Our main interest in your visit is how to explore how public choice economics might help inform the new constitution which will define our future Republican life." They sought input on questions ranging from the way to elect the political authorities to the economic matters that should be included in the document. Buchanan responded with detailed advice on how to bind democracy, delivered over the course of 5 formal lectures to top representatives of a governing elite that melded the military and the corporate world. He spoke plainly and in the imperative mode, suggesting that the government must or should do this or that. He defined public choice as a science that should be adopted for matters ranging from the power of a constitution over fiscal policy to what the optimum number of lawmakers in a legislative body should be. He said of members of his school of thought, and I quote, "We are formulating constitutional ways in which we can limit government intervention in the economy and make sure it keeps its hands out of the pockets of productive contributors," end quote. Buchanan understood that his hosts were seeking a roadmap. He thus explained that the Constitution needed, as he said, severe restrictions on the power of government. He instructed that the first such restriction is that the government must not be free to spend without also, at the same time, collecting the necessary taxes to offset expenses, the mid-century Virginia sacred principle of pay as you go. It must have a constitution, he said, that requires a balanced budget. No more Keynesian deficits under any circumstances. Also, the independence of the central bank should be enshrined in the Constitution. the government should be denied the authority to make monetary policy because doing so would surely lead to inflation. A last restriction, he urged, was to require supermajorities for any change of substance. And I quote, "It must be ensured that a system exists in which only a large majority, 2/3 or 5/6 of the legislative body, can approve each new expense." With this formula, the scholar overshot the mark, even with the military junta's members, just as he had in his proposal for a fire sale of public schools to Virginia's legislature in 1959. None had the nerve to float a 5/6 requirement. If Jim Buchanan had qualms about helping to design a constitution for a dictatorship, or about the authoritarian process by which the final product was ratified, matters reported widely in the press in the US as elsewhere, he did not commit them to print. Instead, he wrote Sergio de Castro with thanks for the fine lunch you held in my honor, and shared how much he enjoyed the whole of, I'm quoting, my visit to Chile. Mrs. Buchanan, who accompanied him, appreciated the nice gifts, the beautiful flowers, the Chilean jewelry, and the wine. This is not a story of purely historical interest, I'm sorry to report. James Buchanan had already known Charles Koch for a decade by the time he went to Chile, and Koch's Cato Institute was so impressed with what the junta wrought in its privatizations that it later hired Pinochet's Minister of Labor to promote Social Security privatization in the United States, with advice from Buchanan about how to achieve this in a democracy where calling for it openly and honestly would have been, in Buchanan's words, political suicide. So he outlined a stealth strategy to achieve it that I describe in the book. But the biggest prize would be amending the US Constitution to undercut the 20th century liberal state. And after extensive efforts by the Koch donor network and its affiliated organizations and allied Republican elected officials, disciplined as they are now by the threat of well-funded primary challenges from the right, another new verb, to be primaried, we now face the prospect of a constitutional convention that could transform American governance. This cause now has the authorization of 27 of the 34 states needed to call such a constitutional convention. That once unimaginable success is in good part due to the radical transformation of so many state governments since 2010. Witnessing this kind of makeover firsthand in North Carolina, in fact, enabled me to understand the Koch endgame in a way I don't think I could have if I stayed in Chicago. I've often thought that I should have included the North Carolina General Assembly in the acknowledgments because I learned a lot from watching them. I arrived in Durham in 2010 just as a radicalized Republican Party, led by Tea Party figures, funded by the Koch network, won majorities in both houses of the state legislature. And suddenly, the things I was still trying to grasp in Buchanan's published writings, because they were quite abstract, became shockingly real. The North Carolina General Assembly's lead donor, Art Pope, a longtime Koch partner, his organization boasted of the Big Bang his grantees were delivering, making this once moderate state, again, a quote, a boast, a laboratory for the cause. They did so in a shock and awe style rollout of radical changes on multiple fronts, adopted at breakneck speed and in defiance of customary procedures such as public hearings. So what did I see happening in this Big Bang? Buchanan had long argued that one needed to stop focusing, particularly if you sought the kind of change that he and his allies did, stop focusing on who rules and think about the rules. And he explained to like thinkers and those who funded them that if you wanted to see the kind of radical change that these libertarians did, you must focus laser-like on systematically changing the rules of governance. And what I saw unfold in North Carolina in 2011 and afterwards was a stunning barrage of changes on this model, one after another. Extreme gerrymandering to misrepresent the will of voters, new measures to undermine workers' ability to organize in unions, particularly public sector unions, attacks on public education at all levels and radical cuts in funding for it while siphoning off tax revenues to private schools that one shock judge said are under no legal obligation to teach students anything. And one actually did teach students nothing in math in 180 days. repeal of a hard-won Racial Justice Act to monitor policing and the criminal justice system, refusal to accept Medicaid expansion of in the Affordable Care Act despite crying need for health care among people who would have received it, rolling back measures to protect the environment and reduce global warming, and then to cap it all off, what Democracy North Carolina, a wonderful organization that had expanded our electorate, called the Monster Voter Suppression Bill, which in some 15 different ways kept people away from the polls who might have been likely to oppose this agenda. And what proved so arresting was that I could see that the new Republican majority was applying Buchanan's ideas, guided by his analysis of the political process to get what they could not get through honest persuasion of the majority. I also saw, though, because of my research, how the critics of all of this, smart, good, well-intentioned people who were shocked at the U-turn their beloved state was taking, how they were missing the deep operational strategy that unified all these varied measures. They could not see that the men pushing this agenda were not misinformed about the likely consequences of the agenda they were pushing. They fully understood that it would inflict grievous harm on many of their fellow citizens, particularly those who would die for lack of health care, as many medical professionals pointed out. But they believed the end game was worth the price. They were, you could say, in cold determination, letting the chips fall where they may. I learned much more in 2013 after Buchanan died, and I finally got access to his private archive at George Mason University in Buchanan House, as it's called. In his papers and his center's records, I found my developing understanding confirmed in a way that sometimes took my breath away. I'll just give you one example. In his private office, I found, stacked helter-skelter on a chair, a pile of documents that exposed how Charles Koch and operatives from the organizations he funded and George Mason University economics faculty and higher administrators had collaborated to establish a base camp for this political project right across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. Once I brought home the hundreds of documents that I had copied there and put them together with Buchanan's writings and other sources, I found myself laying down pieces of a puzzle that sometimes left me nauseated as I realized its scope and its audacity. It now encompasses dozens of ostensibly separate national organizations, some of whose names will be familiar to you: the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, for example. Charles Koch even boasts of having supplied seed money to the Federalist Society. If you add to the national organizations the state-level operations that make up the state policy network, like your own Pioneer Institute and Beacon Hill Institute in Massachusetts, and the international affiliates of the Atlas Network with operations in over 90 countries, we are talking about hundreds and hundreds of well-funded organizations working to bring free-rein capitalism into being without being honest with the people that this is what they seek. Instead, they use bromides such as this. Quote, advancing reforms that promote personal freedom, innovation, opportunity, and a more peaceful society in which all Americans can flourish, end quote. They don't say that what they are really seeking is, in effect, to revoke the 20th century with extreme measures that even most Republican voters don't want, such as ending the minimum wage, replacing progressive taxation with flat taxes, converting Social Security and Medicare to individual accounts with Wall Street firms, destroying the remaining power of labor unions, stopping government action on climate change, suppressing voter participation, and most recently, in North Carolina, creating partisan state judicial elections in newly gerrymandered districts, among other things. Not to mention that constitution of locks and bolts. And the question this stealth plan presents Americans with, once we know it, is at one level, I believe, quite simple. Is what this cause seeks the kind of country we want to live in and what we want to hand on to our children and grandchildren? I believe that is the real public choice. Thank you.
provocative lecture, we want to turn to the audience for questions. I'm sure there are many. Let's see, I have a microphone.
Great.
I guess I'm going to move around Oprah style. Here you are, Vince. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was wonderful. And I very much appreciate you raising the alarm in this way that you're doing. And I hope that the tour is long and successful and you have a lot of people listening to you, because I think this is crucially important. I do want to probe and examine a little bit your sense of surprise at the cold-eyed calculation of this plan, a surprise which I don't share. And I don't share it in part because I take you to be engaging deeply in libertarian thought as a good faith gesture, which I think is important. But I don't think libertarianism was ever libertarian in good faith. In fact, I always assumed that it was a kind of Herrenvolk communitarianism. And I think as you see libertarian thinkers accommodating themselves to white nationalism increasingly, I feel like my own suspicion of libertarianism as a Herrenvolk communitarianism was well-founded and has been vindicated. And so I asked a question, which is, how can you see what's happening in the story that you're telling intersecting with a whole history of racist thought, which really goes all the way back to pro-slavery ideology, which has at its basis the freedom to enslave, right? And you can even push it even further back to John Locke, who was an investor in the Royal African Slave Trading Company and who helped to write the Constitution for the state of South Carolina as a slave state. So I'd like to know where this story intersects, but also is distinguished from and diverges from a longer genealogy of racist thought that has led me not to be surprised at all by what's happening. Thank you.
Very powerful and important intervention and question. I actually have a prologue in the book about John C. Calhoun, because Buchanan's own colleagues at George Mason University, they called, they're a little anachronistic, but they called John C. Calhoun a precursor to public choice thought. And they said, and this is Buchanan's colleagues, they said that Buchanan's thought and Calhoun's thought had the same purpose and effect. So I quite agree with what you're saying, that the kind of property supremacy that this cause is promoting is hard, perhaps impossible, to disentangle in American context from the long history of racial slavery in which ideas about property supremacy existed to deflect any democratic challenge to a system of racial capitalism. So I quite agree there. And I've actually found it interesting that some libertarians have been up in arms about my book and just cannot believe that I would say these things that I found in the archives. And it's interesting to me because I actually held back from what some of my readers wanted me to do along the lines of what you're doing to go beyond and to push on this. And I said, look, I'm not going to go beyond my sources. But also, I really wanted to hold in tension this relationship between race and class and economics and libertarian economics and slavery, because I think that a door closes in many white minds when you say that something or someone is a racist in today's context. And I think they pivot to very shallow psychological, even spiritual understandings of what racism is without grappling with the political economy in which racecraft, as the Field Sisters described it, affects everyone, not just African Americans. And Professor Guinier made that point very powerfully in her work, thinking about canaries in the mine shaft. So I kind of wanted to not make things easy for white readers, but to lead them to understand that this isn't something that is done to someone else that you can just go to sleep about if you know that it's racist, but instead it's coming to after everything that you value as well. I hope that, yeah.
Follow-up. Much of what they want to see in society is much of what would happen during the redemption period after Reconstruction.
Yes.
Which also disenfranchised poor white voters and white working class voters, as we've known since W.E. Du Bois's book in Black Reconstruction.
Yes.
So it seems like it's not brand new, and
Yes.
there's a way in which I think white people, especially working white people, can understand that this is absolutely against their interests.
That's absolutely true. And Buchanan said repeatedly that his favored constitutional rules were those of 1900, not 1960. And 1900, of course, is the Lochner and Plessy era, and one of mass disenfranchisement, which he referred to. He had some euphemism about, I forget, I quoted in the book, but not saying what would be obvious to historians looking at the rules of these years. So yes, I quite agree. And also I think what you're pointing out about the slide between libertarianism and white nationalism. Now I know there are many libertarians who are deeply principled people, who don't see any connection between their views and this kind of thing. But I think if you follow the libertarian funders over time and the organizations pushing this agenda, again and again you see this slide into white nationalism and white ethnic supremacy that goes all the way back to the William Bunker Fund, which paid for Hayek's salary and von Mises' salary, and the setup of Buchanan Center ended up sliding into anti-Semitism and just really, really vile stuff. And I couldn't help noticing either in the reports on Charlottesville how many people had started with libertarianism and ended with torches in the yard. So, it definitely doesn't describe the trajectory of most people, but I think one way to think about this is that libertarians have to provide some explanation of why, if the system is fair and capitalism is a great system, you have people, and particularly people from certain groups, who have not thrived in this system. And I think that's where the thinking gets frightening sometimes, because in explaining that without reference to group power, to class, to the history of race or capitalism, it ends up in a kind of victim-blaming place to say it's these people, it's their culture, it's something wrong with them that they haven't made it in this otherwise great society. So yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there a question on this side of the room?
I've been finding myself going back to Wikipedia often for the definition of the word idiot in the Athenian democratic sense, which means somebody who is only concerned about their own personal interest rather than the interest of the polis, right? And the echo of the word polis goes out to Charles Olston and the Maximus poems and all of that kind of stuff. I'm wondering if anybody has actually looked at libertarianism, as you describe it, as a function of democratic idiocy.
A very nice pointed question. Is Professor Steve Kelman here by any chance? I would love to meet him. I wanted to reach out to him before I came, and I just was too busy. But he wrote a piece about Buchanan's philosophy in 1986 when Buchanan won the Nobel Prize. And he said that public choice economics was not only descriptively wrong about why public actors make the choices that they do, it could be proven wrong empirically, even though Buchanan never showed interest in empirical confirmation of his theories. But Kelman also said that those ideas threaten to undermine the very norm of public spiritedness on which good governance and a decent political culture depend. And I think that he was quite prophetic in that, and that the spread of these ideas has proven utterly toxic to our public life, and you can see them all around you. And I think liberals don't understand that when Donald Trump talks about the swamp, he's not talking about the K Street lobbyists, as so many liberal commentators in the media assume. He's talking about this 20th century model of government, of public sector unions, of environmentalists getting federal grants, of teachers who are trying to reduce class sizes and raise salaries. He's talking about all of those things, not just this narrow stretch of K Street. So I quite agree with you. And I also think, I will say, I would not normally give a scholarly talk of this tenor, but I actually believe that we are at a pivotal moment in our history. I think, we've always had, as Vince was suggesting, these deeply anti-democratic forces in our country, and often in tension with forces who were more committed to the vision of the Declaration of Independence. And I believe this is a moment, like the 1860s and 1870s, like the 1930s, not as dramatic, but where those forces are really in contestation, and we don't know which is going to win out. But I do believe this cause is far along, and I am trying to sound an alarm and say to people, this is an all-hands-on-deck moment for our democracy. As you're suggesting, don't be an idiot and retreat into your private world, because actually some of them are counting on that, and they've joked about how people are much more interested, it seems, in Facebook than in what's going on politically. So we have quite a challenge before us. Yeah.
It's a comment, which is, I just saw a thing on Politico.
Okay, hold on. People can't hear you.
Just saw a thing in Politico on Friday about, Trump was at this values voters thing, and Bannon was wetting his pants. He was so happy. And Moore showed up, and he said he's put Christianity ahead of the Constitution. And this unity that these people are building between Trump and Buchanan, this with the evangelicals is very goddamn powerful, because that adds up, I think, at least, to an ideology, Trump is not what I thought he was, which, Trump might be, but this is not what I thought it was. I thought it was nothing. It's hardly that. Trump could win again, folks. And because the Democrats, us, or at least me, we have to come up with a countervailing ideology. We have to come up with something that will persuade people. So what do we have? Well, we have the environment. We have all of that. That's going to kill us all, whether we're libertarians or not. In the end, I think that the things that liberal Democrats want benefit more people than the things that Buchanan and his friends want. But we're going to have to persuade them, because right now they don't believe that, I don't think. At least many don't.
That's a really important point about how strategic this enterprise has become. If you go back to the 1970s, and I talk about this in the book, when Koch was first setting up the Cato Institute, funding the Reason Foundation, funding these libertarian scholars, et cetera, beginning to fund, he insisted that they should, his phrase, never compromise, right? They had to be, unbendingly radical in what they were doing. Since then, since he got serious about trying to get power and really move this agenda, that has changed. So Cato Institute used to support legalized prostitution, any form of sex between consenting adults, legalization of drugs, all of these other things that would be consistent for a libertarian. You don't hear so much about that anymore. And what you see is many of these libertarians who I describe it in the book, I won't go into more detail, but so hostile to organized religion, thought that people who had religious faith were basically idiots in a different definition, and were quite condescending toward those, now realize that they need the religious right because that's where the voters are. And so where they used to be honest and say that they are libertarians, they realize that libertarianism has only, at best, ever polled about 3 to 4% support in the American electorate. You can't get anywhere with that. But they saw all these votes to be harvested among those who consider themselves conservatives, and that's where they went. And what you see happening in our politics now is that they are quite strategically harnessing various kinds of bigotry on social issues in order to move this agenda. So in North Carolina, we had a homophobic Amendment 1 to the Constitution to prevent same-sex marriage. We had what you've heard about the bathroom bill that used fear of trans people in order to get people to support a law that also prevented local communities from raising their minimum wages and adopting living wages. Attacks on immigrants, saying millions of illegal immigrants are about to steal your elections. So there are really strategic alliances, and I think you can see that in Americans for Prosperity, which is the main ground game effort of this program. The head of it is Tim Phillips, who comes out of the religious right. So there's a very, very self-conscious connecting of these causes and these agendas to try to find what's in it for everyone so that they can get along.
Then you have the Economist magazine, and there's a series of articles on the increased power of monopoly corporations. Which also smashes the lives of Trump's voters along with
All right, thank you. Yeah, so let's go to some other questions. And as I'm moving about, Nancy, I want to follow up on this question and something that you said in your talk, which was a reference to not caring about who rules, but what the rules are. And bring it back to the question of where the political system, and certainly the Democrats, what their role is in all of this. So, and this is what I mean. When I think about at least some efforts to divest the public sector, when I think about things like charter schools, it turns out that there are some Democrats, including our last president, Obama, who were supportive of those kinds of initiatives. And so I wonder, if you think about the scope of your argument, how do you see it? Is it really an argument about a particular party, or is it an argument about a system?
Right, yeah, thank you. I don't think that the Kochs have any sentimental loyalty to the Republican Party. I think that it has become a useful delivery vehicle. Charles Koch funded the Libertarian Party in 1980 to run against Ronald Reagan. So, you know, they're not longstanding committed Republicans. But what they have found is that by changing the incentives in the Republican Party with these primary challenges, you know, as a stick, and then, you know, the flow of cash since Citizens United as a carrot, they can get Republicans to do their bidding. Somebody raised the question of the environment. Let me outline for you how stunningly effective these changing of the incentives efforts are. In the early 1990s, there was no difference between our two major political parties in their assessment of what we now call climate change, right? I mean, they had different notions of what you might do about it, but they all understood that it was man-made and that it was something serious that needed attention. By, I believe it's 2013 or 2014, only eight of 278 Republicans in Congress would admit that climate change was man-made. That is the donor network manipulating the incentives at work. But you are absolutely right that Democrats are also operating in that same system. I think particularly on the public schools, it's a little bit more complicated because after Milliken, you know, made it so that there couldn't be metropolitan desegregation remedies. I think, you know, a lot of black parents in struggling urban communities were left with substandard schools and became targets for this. Heritage and others talked about building non-traditional alliances to those black parents because they couldn't get any white suburbanites to want vouchers instead of their good public schools. So Democrats have been particularly prey to that, and also I think with the flood of cash into the system, Democrats have become even more dependent on particularly the financial sector. And so that has been a terribly distorting influence. But I think also within the Democratic Party now, you're also seeing a kind of a struggle for the soul of the party as we're seeing a struggle for the soul of our democracy. So there's much work to be done and much more to be learned in many places, I think.
I loved your book.
Thank you.
I really did. I learned a lot. The intellectual history going all the way from Calhoun through the Kochs was really fascinating. I appreciated it. I'd like, if you wouldn't mind, to think about this, putting your social movement hat on, not just the intellectual underpinnings of a social movement, but the democratic, let me put it again, the skills and resources of people who participate in a social movement.
Right.
The thing I read over this weekend that really shocked me was the declining support for the necessity of democracy as a governmental form as generations get younger, so that the World War II generation feels it's more important than the boomers, who feel it's more important than the Xers, who feel it's more important than the millennials. That's really frightening because it doesn't just talk about the policy issue, it goes to the rules. I mean, if you have a minimal amount of support or a declining amount of support for the importance of democratic processes in and of themselves, that's really a problem. At the same time, it's a generation that isn't getting an enormous amount of experience in self-governance, okay, which is what the boomers did when they started to overturn institutions, at least started to practice in various ways, whether it's the women's community or the LGBT community or the civil rights movement. These are all experiences in self-governance, right? Which then, of course, bring you to a place where you have more skills, right, in order to participate in the large polity, should you ever get to the top of an elite hierarchy, right? And so they not only don't have those skills, but they don't see governance working.
Yes.
Okay? And so I'm just asking you where you think the ignition is, right? The ignition point is for this. Because I actually see as, a very small cadre of them being extremely active and thinking in terms of common purpose, right? And they're going into the professions like urban planning and all kinds of things that think about a public good. But I don't see it in a political sense.
Another crucial question. Thank you. You're hitting a really important problem. And I will say, I actually start, after the prologue, the first chapter is about the Prince Edward County student strike for a decent school, which was organized by a young woman who was active in student government. The young people who waged this strike, who created one of the cases that went into Brown, they were active in student government. And that's kind of a history that we don't pay attention to. And there's a similar one for Mexican Americans, I know from the work of Mark Rodriguez. So I think you're absolutely right to think about, what are the training experiences young people are getting or not getting in our current world. And I can tell you, too, in the interest of time, I didn't say this, but the right is paying a fortune for internships for young people. I was just speaking with a journalist whose son went to the American Enterprise Institute. They had something like 70 summer internships, fully funded, with living expenses and everything at the American Enterprise Institute. Heritage, you find a similar story. It goes on and on. So they're even developing programs for K through 12 teachers and for high school students. So the right is very actively training people in these ideas and in political leadership. You don't see a similar effort on the left or in the mainstream, for that matter. Just as a signal of how again, I keep coming back to the word toxic all this is, but I think I'm the only one who's read all these books from the right about which, so you don't have to. And Grover Norquist has a book called the Leave Us Alone Coalition, or something about Leave Us Alone, where he envisions the two sides of American politics. But he actually says at one point that he can't wait for those we would call the greatest generation to die off, because they are so, to his mind, committed to government. I mean, he actually uses language like that. Like he's just waiting for them to die. But then this is a man who did his training with Jonas Savimbi in Utah. Anyway, that is a real problem. I don't know how to address it. And it's interesting doing talks about this book. People want to know, what's the solution? What do we do? And I have to keep coming back to the fact that I'm a historian, right? I can tell a story about how we got here, but I don't actually represent anyone other than myself, And so I have some ideas about what we might do, but what I'm trying to do is get this story to organizations that are in the trenches, that do have memberships, that do have accountability, and do have had long-standing conversations about this.
Okay, so we have many more questions. Let's see. Why don't I go over here?
Hi, I very much appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
You said you have some ideas about what we might do. I was wondering if taxing the wealth of individuals was one of them, because that's a topic we just don't seem to be able to get on at any level, local, state, federal. Nobody will touch the question of taxing wealth, and I think Piketty has pretty well documented the concentration of wealth that exists in America and worldwide. So how do we get started on that agenda?
I think that's crucially important, and goes back to Professor Brown-Nagin's question about the Democrats, because part of our problem is that nobody will defend taxation in our world. And I think that is one of the core conversations that we need to have, is that, taxation is the price of a civilized society, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, right? And so if we're unwilling to do that, then we can't address any of this. And I'm glad that you raised Piketty, and others have also pointed out that taxing extreme wealth is not just about creating a sustainable economy. It's about democracy surviving, because we have allowed the concentration of wealth to develop in our society to such a point where we have this class of arch-right extreme billionaires whose politics, it has been shown, are far to the right of even Republicans, and who have taken it upon themselves and who believe they are justified in trying to transform our system. And so if we don't find a way of dealing with that, I think that we're going to really be in significant trouble.
We need to end, but this lady has been very patient, and she wants to answer.
And we can talk informally at the
Yes,
signing,
yes,
too,
yes.
if people have other questions.
I'd like to make a comment, and that is to thank you for doing this work, because I've been telling everybody this is a must-read.
Thank you.
Yes.
We have gotten to the point where people don't know the history and have been blind, and we have to start somewhere, so the education is there. And what I don't understand, what kind of a society do these millionaires think they will have
Right.
when people are sick? That's setting the stage for an endemic. People don't have jobs. The destruction of our society is not just the government. Rome didn't last for a day, and maybe this United States of America isn't going to last forever.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your, yeah, there we go.
That was a wonderful way to conclude. Thank you.